Now, most people are most familiar with the Dow Jones Industrial Average. How many stocks in the Dow Jones Industrial Average? 30. Who am I going to ask this one? Casey, how many stocks in the S&P 500?
500.
Yeah. That's right, yeah. What was the color of George Washington's white horse? Okay, so, all right, so there's 500 stocks in the S&P 500. But how many stocks to the nearest 1,000? How many stocks traded on the New York Stock Exchange? Does anybody know? To the nearest 1,000? Well, call it 3,000. Let's say there's about 3. And what about the American exchange? How many stocks traded on the American exchange? Anybody know about?
400.
Maybe only 400. Well, the last time I checked, it was 1,000. And how many in NASDAQ? What does NASDAQ stand for? National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotation, right? So that's just an electronic market, right? There's no premises. New York Stock Exchange, there's a premises. There's a building. American Stock Exchange, there's a building. For the NASDAQ, automated, right? There's no premises. It's all electronic, what we used to call over the counter. How many stocks traded on the NASDAQ? About. Say 5,000. So now we've got 3,000, 1,000, 5,000, you know, we're up to almost 10, right? So there's many, many stocks listed. So let me ask you this question. Why, then, does the Dow only have 30 stocks? Listen.
Because it represents 95% of the total stock.
Because the Dow stocks are so big and such huge firms that they represent a disproportional interest, you know, the disproportional share of all the trading that goes on, right? They're the huge companies, right? Traditionally firms like General Motors, and more lately firms like let's say Microsoft and so on. So these are the General Electric. These are the biggest of the big. Most of the trading goes on in these stocks. See, the trouble if you just take an average of all the stocks that are traded on all the exchanges, there's lots of stocks that don't do much. They're tiny little companies that no one's interested in. So it's a real problem. How do you really represent the stock market? You know, how do you create an average? You can't just do all the stocks. So what did Dow do? Dow took 30. The Dow's, what, over 110, maybe 120 years old. The S&P 500, that's 500 stocks. Now, of course, all of those, they represent, you know, they try to represent stocks across the board, a little from this industry, a little from that industry, and so on. But the nice thing about the S&P is the Standard & Poor's covers stocks that are in NASDAQ and stocks that are traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange stocks tend to be what they call the blue chips. The NASDAQ tend to be the up-and-comers. And so the nice thing about the S&P, it covers some of what we call the up-and-comers or the technology stocks, as well as some of the old standbys like General Motors. So most folks, when they talk about the stock market, prefer the S&P 500. Okay? That's what they prefer, and that's why we're covering it today. All right? Is everybody clear on that? So that's why we're going to use it to measure the stock market.